Okay, welcome to this public lecture on the impact of COVID-19 on food systems and food security. I will talk mostly about really what COVID-19 means for food security, but before doing so, I would like to clarify a few terms around food systems because not everybody may be very familiar with this term. Food systems in general are all the activities and the actions involved in the production, but also in the distribution and processing and the consumption of food and the relevant outcomes. And the goal of a food system or of food systems more generally is to provide healthy nutrition for all. Even without COVID-19, we are aware of the fact that there's widespread malnutrition. I mean, 700 million people, that's the most recent estimate before COVID-19, suffer from hunger. In a calorie sense, around 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. And over 2 billion are either overweight or obese with related chronic diseases which often occur resulting from obesity. So we're recognizing that even without COVID-19, we have serious problems of malnutrition, meaning that the goal of providing healthy nutrition for all is not achieved. Another term, and certainly related one, is sustainable food systems. So what makes food systems sustainable? Of course, we're still looking at the overall goal of providing healthy nutrition, but in addition to human health, we're looking at planetary health. So we're doing this or trying to do this, providing healthy nutrition without exceeding the planetary boundaries. And another term which has become more popular recently is resilient food systems. And resilience means that, of course, they still need to be sustainable, but they also need to be robust to shocks. And one of these shocks can be pandemics, such as COVID-19, but of course, there can also be other shocks, such as climate calamities and other types of risks. And resilience means robustness to all the different shocks that can occur. So with this terminology, let's now lead over to the actual question, COVID-19 and food systems. When you're asking, and several studies have done that, asking consumers in Europe, what is it? What pictures come to your mind when you think of COVID-19 and food systems? And many people in Europe, what they associate with COVID-19 and food is the empty shelves that they experienced during the first weeks of the first lockdown last year in March. Some of the foods were just not there, and that usually was only holding for a few days or a few weeks at maximum. But people remember this because this was probably for many the first time that they experienced empty shelves for quite a while. Another thing that people certainly associate with COVID-19 and food systems is the fact that during the lockdowns, restaurants are closed and also other food services, cafeterias, canteens, and so on. And that certainly means that more food is prepared and eaten at home, and that can mean, well, different types of foods, different time that it takes, and different experiences. So restaurants are or were closed. When you then further ask, well, is there anything else that comes to your mind? Many people say, yep, I have read about these meat slaughterhouse and meat processing plant incidences of super spreading events of COVID-19. That's something that people often remember. And then during last spring, also around March, April, in the news, there were many reports about labor shortages, especially for vegetable harvests in Western Europe. So many of the countries, including Germany, but also other Western European countries that have horticultural production, such as asparagus and other types of vegetables, These require quite a bit of labor for harvesting, and often this labor comes over from Eastern European countries. But the borders were closed, so for a couple of weeks, these laborers couldn't enter Western Europe, and therefore there were indeed labor shortages for the harvest of asparagus and other vegetables. Those are the key things that people have in mind, but obviously what we want to do in this lecture is look a little bit more deeply and systematically of what COVID-19 means, not only in Germany or Western Europe, but also in other parts of the world, and what the food security effects are. And one thing that we have to realize is that COVID-19 occurs in almost all parts of the world. This graphic here might imply that the largest number of incidences are in Europe and North America, which is true for the confirmed cases, but it's not probably true for the total numbers. It's just a matter of fact that in developing countries, much less is measured, so less testing is done, and certainly then the confirmed cases are also lower. But it's a matter of fact that occurs everywhere on our planet fairly much, and it's also a matter of fact that the majority of the countries, far above 100 countries, have or had lockdown measures of different length and different strictness, often for several months. And just as we see in Europe, also many other regions of the world didn't only have one lockdown period, but are in the second or third lockdown already. And this is certainly leading to economic losses, to losses in gross domestic product. The World Bank has estimated that in 2020, the world GDP contracted by about 5%. And we know that this is certainly driving up poverty numbers. Poverty reduction was quite successful in recent years and decades. But we see here that based on the decline in economic growth, the estimates of increasing poverty rates from around 8.4 up to 9.4 in 2020, and then probably continuing at this higher magnitude also in 2021. These are somewhat more optimistic projections, but still a notable increase in the prevalence of poverty. If we put that into concrete and absolute numbers, it's estimated that last year the number of extremely poor people with less than $1 a day probably increased by about 150 million, and the number of hungry people, those that do not have access to sufficient calories and food energy, might have increased by around 130 million. And that's huge. I mean, it's an increase in about 20% of the total number of hungry people, and we need to understand why. What are the main reasons for this large increase in poverty and hunger? Well, if you look at the food systems, then in principle, there are three broad areas where we could expect COVID-19 to have effects, and of course, related lockdown measures. It could be either in agriculture production, or it could be in food processing and distribution, or it could be in consumers' access to food, in the sense that consumers lost to some extent their income that makes food accessible and affordable. Now, if we look at effects on agriculture production, actually these were relatively small globally. That doesn't mean that in individual situations, farmers might not have late access to inputs and may have to delay the cultivation or perhaps the harvest for a couple of weeks. That's possible. But there are no reports of major production shortfalls. And some might argue, but didn't we see those empty shelves? Yes, but the empty shelves in the supermarkets were not due to lower production. They were due to consumer hoarding behavior. Yeah, when you're going into the supermarket and everybody buys 10 packets of pasta instead of just 1 or 2 per week, then of course the shelves are empty, and that's not related to lower overall production or supply. How about food processing and distribution? Well, We did see some disruptions in the distribution along the supply chains, and these were actually much more significant in developing countries than they were in high-income countries. So in high-income countries, we saw some effects, but relatively small. And I have more details on this in a second. The consumer economic access part also needs to be differentiated. Relatively small effects in high-income countries, at least when it comes to food security, whereas serious food security implications of lost income in developing countries. And these are things that I'd like to explain in some more detail in the following. So let's start with the effects of COVID-19 and related lockdown measures in high-income countries. And when we look along the supply chain, let's first of all understand what's happening to farmers and farm gate prices. Well, we are particularly interested in this part of the figure here after March 2020. This is when the first lockdown started. But of course, there's always some price variation, and we need to look for patterns that are quite different from what happened around the same time of the year in previous years. So let's take out asparagus, which has a very notable price pattern because it's only seasonal product. It's in larger quantities, at least only marketed during certain times of the year. And usually, around March, we see the first harvest happening, and then it's a very notable price decline, and we see that every year. We also saw that in 2020, with the only exception that, well, there was an increase in the price in March, and this was due to the fact that indeed, farmers weren't able to harvest as rapidly as they would usually with more Eastern European laborers, and that meant that prices that those farmers who were able to harvest were somewhat higher. We see a similar development also for tomato prices. Yeah, this is the green line here, and it increased. But this was only for a few weeks, and after that, price developments were pretty normal, as they are also during other years, during normal years without a COVID-19 pandemic. Another somewhat unusual price development was this gray line here, which is pig meat. And there was a decline here during a 2-month period. And this was largely due to the fact that a few of the slaughterhouses for pigs were actually closed due to super spreading events. And this means farmers had their pigs readily fattened and they wanted to sell them to a slaughterhouse, but they couldn't. And that means the prices that farmers could obtain really dropped because there was a disruption in the slaughtering and processing further downstream. But also here, after about 6 weeks or so, prices were back to their normal levels. How about consumers? This graph here on the right shows developments of the consumer price index, and we see the orange line here is for food consumer prices, and we see that in March and the few weeks after that, 2020, the prices increased somewhat more rapidly than we would have expected it without the lockdown measures. And they increased, food prices increased somewhat more strongly than other consumer goods. But also here we see, okay, it was not very strong. If you look at the units here, it was not very strong. And after a few weeks, it was actually back to normal price developments, just as for any other consumer goods as well. So overall, we can conclude that the effects of the lockdown measures on food supply chains in high-income countries were relatively small and short-term. And how about income? Well, of course, people lost income. Many people in many different sectors lost income. But the thing is that this wasn't leading to food insecurity because we have a social welfare state and social safety nets that prevent people from falling into a food insecurity trap. And that means the hunger or food insecurity or more generally dietary implications were relatively small. That's the situation in rich countries. So why are the food security effects of COVID-19 much more pronounced in developing countries? There are a couple of reasons. The most important ones are listed here. Well, first of all, people in poor countries are poorer and more food insecure anyway. And this means that any disruption, regardless how big it is, will have larger effects as well. I mean, just imagine that many poor people spend more than 70% of their income on food. Well, of course, even if food prices rise only to a limited extent. I mean, poor people will have to consume less just because they cannot afford more. Also, traditional food supply chains are much more affected to lockdown measures or vulnerable to lockdown measures than more modern supply chains. I'll have a bit more to say on this on the next slide, but I think this graph here, which shows a typical wholesale food market, is already telling us what's meant here, because you have sprawling places where hygiene conditions and social distancing rules are very hard to maintain. And this means those places are sometimes just closed down so that no trade is happening anymore in lockdown measures. The third point here is, well, many of the poor work in the informal sector. They don't receive any benefits when they can't work. They can't do any home office or so. No, I mean, many people in the informal sector have just lost all of their income overnight with the lockdown setting in. At the same time, poor countries have much lower financial capacities to compensate for income losses of people. There are often no social safety nets in place. And not only that, the fifth point means that many poor households who are regularly dependent on certain support measures lost these support measures during lockdown. A typical example is school feeding programs where 500 million children around the world in poor countries receive a warm meal every day. But when schools are closed, they wouldn't receive those meals. And this means if you're a family with several children that usually go to school and participate in the school feeding programs, suddenly you have to feed and nourish your children at home. And that's certainly leading to hardship and leading to income scarcities and with the result that people cannot afford enough food for the whole family. Let's look a little bit more schematically into what's happening to food prices at different parts of the supply chain when a lockdown happens. The x-axis here shows time and the y-axis shows food prices. And usually we have, certain variations in prices. The urban consumer price is usually somewhat higher than the rural producer price because there's the marketing margin and transport and transactions costs in between. But they are usually closely related to prices. And suddenly a lockdown sets in. And this is when, in traditional supply chains, at least, a strong divergence of prices occurs. Traders and transporters are seriously restricted in their mobility. Wholesale markets are partly closed or seriously restricted. And even processing plants that are not able to fulfill hygiene and distancing conditions will be closed down or reduced in their capacity. This means that farmers are still producing and harvesting, but they only can sell locally at very low prices because the movement of the produce into the urban centers doesn't happen with the same efficiency as it would usually happen. Whereas in urban centers, there are food shortages, there are piles of food in rural areas and food shortages in urban areas, leading to very high prices. And of course, these effects are much stronger in traditional small and medium scale enterprises than in large modern enterprises with much more mechanization. And also when we look at the types of foods, these divergences and the problems occur much more strongly for nutritious and perishable foods such as fresh fruits and vegetables and dairy products than in staple foods, where it doesn't matter which you can store. If you don't sell them today, you sell them tomorrow or next week. For storable staple foods, it's not such a big problem than it is for fresh fruits and vegetables or other perishable foods that are just rotten after 2 or 3 days lying out there in the sun. And this is reflected also in dietary quality of people, especially in urban areas. This is data here from Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia, where households reported over a 7-day period what types of food they consumed. We see here for cereal grains that most households close to 100% consume them on a regular basis, and there isn't a big difference before and during the lockdown. But the differences occur particularly for the more perishable foods such as fresh fruits and vegetables, where regular consumption dropped to only 60% of the households consuming, and similarly also for meat and dairy products and other perishable foods. Some may now ask, well, how do we know if there are really lockdown measures? Where do the data come from? Did people reach out to those households? Well, usually these surveys during lockdowns happen through phone interviews, and that means, well, the data may not be super reliable and accurate. But the fact that this is not only occurring in one place, but we see very similar patterns also in other countries and cities and regions of Africa and Asia tells us that, well, there seems to be a real trend in a deterioration of dietary quality. Also, poor households are usually more affected than rich households. And it's a combination of two things. First of all, higher prices and lower availability of nutritious foods in urban centers. And of course, at the same time, also lower affordability because these households lost a lot of their income. When we look at how much of the income some of the households lost, these are data from South Africa here, we're seeing that actually all types of households do experience significant income losses on average during lockdown periods, but the losses are much more pronounced for those with low educational levels than for those with higher educational levels. And this is also very plausible. I mean, if you look at people with higher college or university type of education, these are usually people who work in office jobs. They have formal employment contracts, and even if there is a lockdown and they can't go to work, they will continue receiving some of their income, or they do home office, which they can in their white-collar jobs, but which obviously people who are working, in the informal sector or in such types of employments here, which you see on the pictures, there's nothing like home office. So you would just lose all of your income overnight, and this is why people with low education levels at the lower income spectrum are much more affected than better off people with higher levels of education. Some may say, well, I don't fully trust those self-reported data. And I would like to share with you insights from a study on India, which used other types of data. They were using data on electricity consumption of private households. Well, some of the poorest households in rural areas may not have access to electricity, but in urban areas, households usually tend to have access to electricity. But when they are losing some of their income, they're using light and other electronic devices much less. And this is what we see here in particular for India, where a lockdown was implemented also starting in March 2020. We see a sharp decline in the use of electricity. And then the lockdown was lifted in early May. And we see that, yes, indeed, households got back to work, had more income available, and also increased their electricity consumption again. but they were not back to previous levels. I mean, even in September, they were, 8 to 10% below previous levels, which also means that there are some longer term effects on the welfare and living standards of households. Another way of looking at this is night light intensity, which you see from satellite images. So you see when you look at from satellite pictures at where are the urban settlements, where do you see a lot of light during night times. You can measure the light intensity in terms of indices. And India is a place where you have a lot of population growth, and you see that on the satellite pictures that they get brighter and brighter because more light is used. And we see here the yellow columns are showing average growth rates of night light intensity between 2017 and 2019, which were on a monthly basis growth rates of around 4%. The same was also true in February 2020, but then the lockdown in 2020 set in and night light intensity went down by quite a few percentage points and stayed down even after the lockdown to some extent. So the same picture as we saw here for electricity consumption, also for night light intensity. And you can expect similar patterns also in other countries because people did report much lower incomes during and after lockdown periods. This is a graph which shows for a couple of countries how the lockdown affected access to food and food insecurity more generally. Many households who weren't able to access sufficient calories and nutrients. In Myanmar, for instance, which is a country where normally food insecurity is not very widespread, only affecting 10 or 11% of the households, but during the lockdown it went up to more than 25%. Uganda from 30 to over 50%. In Ethiopia, we see a sharp increase. Interesting, however, is that a few of the households in Ethiopia are covered under a social safety net program. These are the households who are poorer and more food insecure in general. But we see that those who are covered under this social safety net were actually not seeing such a sharp additional increase in food insecurity. So this is a clear indication that social safety nets can help to cushion households and not let them fall into further food insecurity during times of lockdown. Overall, we need to be aware of the fact that the effects in poor countries can be much more long-term than what we would generally expect from our European perspective. I mean, here in Europe, we are, hoping that in the second half of 2020, everything will be over. We hope that by the summer, most will be vaccinated. If not, then it will be fall. But definitely our hope is by 2020, by the end of the year, by the end of 2021, the worst things will be over. But this is quite different in many poor countries in the world. This is a graph here from The Economist, which was an article published about 3 weeks ago, which expects that in many poor countries of Africa and Asia, it may take until the end of 2023 until the majority of the population can be vaccinated, which is due to the unavailability of vaccines. All the rich countries are now seeing how they get enough for themselves, but poor countries in Africa don't have access. But even if they have, perhaps next year it'll take quite a while until the majority of the population is vaccinated due to logistical problems. And this means these countries will not only for a few additional years, but months, but for a few additional years, probably see repeated lockdown measures, loss of GDP, which will lead to lower spending, public spending on infrastructure and other things that are important for development. There will be much less travel. I mean, who wants to travel to places where the pandemic is still up and running? And Many people don't fully see what that means for the GDP of countries. I mean, on average, countries in Africa get close to 10% of their GDP from traveling, from tourists and business related travel. There are school closures which happen over extended periods of times. In 2020, many African countries had schools closed for more than 6 months. And it's problematic in Germany and rich countries if schools are closed, but there's homeschooling. I mean, students have access to internet and they get at least some level of homeschooling, but you can imagine that in most countries in Africa, people don't have access to internet and there's zero homeschooling. So that means for extended periods of time, the students don't get any information from school. They will drop out from school. Some of the girls in particular get pregnant and will probably never ever return to school again, even if schools open. This means there will be larger population growth, rising fertility rates, large parts of the current generations which will not have proper schooling, and this can lead to stagnation of poverty for much longer periods of time than what we would usually expect. So here we need, as an international community, certainly to keep that in mind and help as good as we can. Let's now turn to the question, how can food systems be made more resilient? And when you ask again in the European public, many people believe that, well, local or regional food supply chains, you really depend much less on international trade, would be more resilient. And this is also what many countries in the world did. There are more than 20 countries that had trade restrictions in terms of export bans or so as a response to the pandemic. But let's take a closer look. I mean, trade restrictions such as import or export bans can actually worsen the situation as they amplify price extremes. I mean, when you're a country that's depending on imports and you can't get those imports anymore, of course, I mean, your food prices will skyrocket and that'll deteriorate further food insecurity of your population. And when you're a country that regularly exports, then prices in your country, when you restrict those exports, will plummet and your farmers will suffer. So price extremes will be further exacerbated by trade restrictions. And this in spite of the fact that COVID-19 is certainly not spread through food trade. It's spread by people, but not by food products. And we also know that in lockdown times, global supply chains often work much more efficiently and better than local ones. So it's not a good policy to restrict it, to restrict trade and think in terms of local. On top of that, as mentioned previously, pandemics are not the only risk that can happen. I mean, there are shocks resulting from climate calamities, and we know that those shocks are likely to be particularly severe in those red areas here, so in parts of the world that are poor anyway. And imagine that you're depending on your local supply only, and there is a climate shock such as a drought or a flood or a hurricane that wipes out your harvest. Of course, you will depend on efficient international trade. So resilient food systems do require efficient international trade, and the notion that local supply chains are more resilient is just not what we observe in reality. Another aspect, of course, to make food systems and supply chains more resilient means we need to improve market functioning. Supply chains need to be modernized with improved sanitation conditions. We need to reduce inefficient regulations. And also countries that implement lockdown measures have to be aware of the side effects well, just close markets. This may be good for reducing the spread of the COVID-19, but it may really be bad for people's access to food. And of course, that needs to be well adjusted. Policy measures need to be adjusted, understanding supply chains and adjusted to the current situation in a particular country. One thing that I like to highlight is that social safety nets will matter. They do matter, and they will matter more in the future, with risks of climate and pandemics likely increasing. And you can't establish social safety nets once a shock occurred. This is way too late. I mean, social safety nets have to be in place. And then if a shock happens, you can increase what is being dispersed, but you have to have the system in place early on. Even in countries like Germany, we see that many of the compensation measures, they don't really start running because the systems are not in place, and a lot of the businesses and households are still waiting for some of the government payouts. And that's something that, of course, also holds in poor countries. The international community also needs to help in this respect. What can be done in order to reduce the risk of pandemics occurring? Well, many of the recent epidemics and pandemics are zoonotic diseases that are originating from wild animals. When you look at this table here, which includes COVID-19, but also some of the other recent epidemics that occurred in parts of the world, yes, they do originate often from wild animals, and sometimes farm animals are amplifying hosts. So that means expanding agriculture and other human activity into natural habitats does increase the pandemic risk. And if you do that, and on top have intensive livestock farming coupled with low hygiene conditions, this will also increase the pandemic risk. So what are the lessons to be learned from that? One of the lessons is that reduced consumption of meat and other animal source foods will lower pandemic risk for at least two reasons. First of all, you don't keep intensive livestock, and that'll reduce the risk of spreading, but you also need less land. I mean, a significant part of the land worldwide is used for fodder production for animals. So if you reduce animal consumption, of course, there's lower land needs, and that means lower need to spread further into natural habitats. Another lesson to be learned is that high yields on the given farmland are important and will reduce the need for further land expansion. So many people believe that, well, organic farming can help. But organic farming with low yields doesn't help in this respect, because it means that more land is required, and there's more needs to deforest and go into natural habitats. So we need high yields, and of course that'll require new forms of technology in order to do so in an environmentally friendly way. Let me come to my last slide, the conclusions. I think it became clear that COVID-19 and related lockdown measures has huge negative effects on global food security, and that the effects are much more pronounced and long-term in developing countries than they are in high-income countries. We need to work hard towards increasing the resilience of food systems with respect to not only pandemics, but also climate risks. And we need to be seeing that some of the popular views on how to increase the resilience are not always correct. So we need to understand what the problems are and address them properly. Thank you very much for your attention.